Welcome to Silent Queen's Reckoning. I'm so glad you could join us today. Now let's dive right into the story.
The 24-year-old mistress was draped over the balcony railing, a glass of champagne in her hand, complaining about how boring her lover's wife was. Inside the shadow of the doorway, the wife stood perfectly still, holding her husband's phone charger. She listened as her husband laughed, kissed his mistress's neck, and said, "Don't worry, baby. The second that broke woman finishes paying off my startup debt, I'm throwing her out. She's not my class." The husband didn't know that the quiet, supposedly broke woman standing in the shadows was the sole heir to a $50 billion private equity empire. And he didn't know that she was about to show him exactly what class really looked like. Chapter 1: The Balcony. Some moments in life arrive quietly, without thunder, without warning, without the courtesy of preparation. They slip through the cracks of a perfectly normal evening and shatter the foundation of everything you believe to be true. For Eleanor Sterling, that moment arrived on a rooftop terrace overlooking the glittering skyline of Chicago. The rooftop was alive with music and laughter. Warm golden fairy lights were strung across the iron railings, and the clinking of crystal glasses cut through the crisp autumn air. It was a networking party hosted by one of her husband's wealthy investors. Richard, her handsome, charismatic husband, had insisted they attend. "These are my people, Eleanor," Richard had said earlier that evening in their apartment, adjusting his expensive silver cufflinks with a pride she had once deeply admired. "You need to mingle. Just smile, look pretty, and try not to talk about your boring accounting job. You will enjoy yourself." Eleanor had smiled patiently. She slipped into a simple, elegant navy dress that fit just right, not too loud, not too quiet. For 3 years, she had learned how to exist in his flashy world without drawing attention away from him. She greeted people politely, laughed when expected, and kept her sharp, analytical observations entirely to herself. Richard moved through the affluent crowd like he owned the air. He was charming, confident, spinning tales about his tech startup's impending success. This was the version of him that had first drawn her in when they met at a small coffee shop in Brooklyn. He had been a struggling entrepreneur with a vision. She had been a quiet girl in a plain sweater reading a book on macroeconomics. But something about the way he laughed tonight felt fundamentally different. It was too loud, too careless. It was the laugh of a man who believed he was entirely untouchable. At some point, Richard excused himself and stepped out onto the secluded side balcony with a glass of whiskey. Eleanor noticed only because he had leaned close to her ear beforehand and whispered, "Bring me my phone charger from the coat check when you come out." It was such a small request, so arrogant, yet so ordinary, that she didn't think twice. A few minutes later, Eleanor picked up his white charging cable and followed the soft glow of the balcony lights. The heavy glass door was slightly ajar, letting in the chill of the night. She didn't mean to pause. She didn't mean to eavesdrop. But then she heard her name. Not directly, not clearly, but the tone was enough to make her steps slow to a halt. She stood just inside the shadow of the heavy curtains, invisible to the two people standing near the edge of the terrace. Richard was not alone. Standing with him was Mia. She was 24, a junior public relations assistant at his firm. She was blonde, vibrant, and wearing a backless crimson dress that left very little to the imagination. Eleanor had seen her around the office. Mia had always looked at Eleanor with a thinly veiled, condescending pity, treating her like the drab, unfortunate anchor holding Richard down. Now, Mia had her arms wrapped tightly around Richard's neck. "I just don't understand how you can stand going home to her every night." "Richard," Mia whined, her voice laced with a sickeningly sweet pout. "She is so plain. She doesn't even know who half the people in this room are. It is embarrassing." Richard chuckled. It was a dark, amused sound. He wrapped his arm around Mia's waist, pulling her flush against him. "You think I'm going to struggle with her forever?" Richard asked, taking a sip of his whiskey. "I just need time, baby." "Time for what?" Mia pouted, tracing a manicured nail down his chest. Richard's voice grew colder, sharper. It lacked any trace of the warmth he used when he kissed Eleanor goodbye in the mornings. "When she finishes paying off my initial startup debt, I am leaving her," Richard said smoothly. The words didn't crash into Eleanor. They slid under her skin, cold and deliberate, like a surgeon's scalpel. For a fraction of a second, she thought the wind had distorted his voice. She thought she had misheard. "She's useful," Richard continued, leaning down to kiss Mia's neck. But she's not permanent. She thinks we are building a future. Stupid, blind loyalty. Mia giggled, a sharp, triumphant sound. But what if she stops paying? She won't. Richard scoffed lightly. She makes a decent salary at that boring accounting firm, and she's obsessed with being the supportive wife. Once my Series B funding clears, and her name is off the final loan document, I'm free. I'll throw her out. She's simply not my class, Mia. You are. Eleanor froze inside the shadow of the doorway. Her fingers tightened around the plastic charging block until her knuckles turned bone white. The hard plastic pressed painfully into her palm, but she didn't flinch. She didn't breathe. Class. The word echoed in her mind, louder than the pulsing bass of the music inside. Richard thought she was a middle-class accountant from small town. He thought she was desperately holding on to him because he was her ticket to a glamorous life. He thought he was using her salary as a bridge to cross into the world of the elite. He had absolutely no idea who he had married. Eleanor's maiden name was not Evans. It was Sterling. She was the youngest daughter of Jonathan Sterling, the notoriously reclusive founder of Sterling Global, a massive international private equity conglomerate. The Sterling family wealth was ancient, vast, and completely off the public grid. Eleanor had grown up suffocated by that wealth. She had watched money turn her relatives into paranoid sociopaths and attract a never-ending swarm of gold diggers. In her mid-20s, desperate for a normal life, she had struck a deal with her father. She wanted to disappear. She wanted to live as an ordinary person, to find someone who loved her for her mind, not her massive trust fund. Her father had agreed, but on one condition: she would remain under the quiet, invisible protection of the family's financial infrastructure. The boring accounting firm she worked at was actually a shell subsidiary fully funded by Sterling Global. The luxury apartment Richard thought they were renting was owned by a Sterling proxy, and the startup debt Richard was so eagerly letting her pay off. Eleanor had planned to surprise him tonight. Tucked inside her sleek clutch purse was a certified bank document. She had used her own pocket money to silently buy out the remaining $2 million of his high-interest corporate loans, intending to present it to him as an anniversary gift. She felt something inside her chest tighten, then settle into a stillness that was infinitely more terrifying than anger. She didn't step forward. She didn't burst onto the balcony to scream, throw her champagne in his face, or demand an explanation. Her instincts, honed by a family of ruthless corporate sharks, took over completely. This was not a slip of the tongue. This was not a drunken mistake. This was a calculated, predatory plan. Eleanor took a slow, silent step back into the warmth of the party. When Richard returned to their table 10 minutes later, smelling faintly of Mia's vanilla perfume, he was smiling his golden, charismatic smile. He leaned down and kissed Eleanor's forehead as if he hadn't just plotted her destruction. "You okay, darling?" he asked, touching her shoulder. "You seem quiet." Eleanor looked up at him. She really looked at him for the first time in 3 years. She saw past the tailored suit and the charming smile. She saw the parasite underneath. "I'm perfect, Richard," she replied. Her voice was smooth, pleasant, and entirely empty. The lie came easily, and as she held his gaze, she realized something with quiet, absolute certainty. This was the last night she would ever play the victim. Richard wanted to talk about class. She was going to give him a master class in ruin. Chapter 2: The inventory. The rest of the evening moved like a flawless, highly choreographed performance. Eleanor laughed at the right moments, nodded when spoken to, and kept her posture perfectly relaxed. But inside, the architecture of her mind had completely shifted. The sympathy, the love, the endless reservoir of patience she had reserved for her husband instantly calcified into something hard and weaponized. Later that night, as they drove back to their apartment, Richard reached over the center console and squeezed her hand. "You work too hard, Elle," he said, his tone dripping with manufactured affection. "You should slow down. Let me take the reins soon." "Maybe," she replied softly, staring out the window at the passing streetlights. When they got home, Richard went straight to the bedroom, tossing his expensive jacket aside. "I'm exhausted," he muttered. "Come to bed soon." Eleanor nodded, but she didn't follow him. Instead, she waited until she heard the deep, rhythmic breathing of his sleep. Then, she walked into the small home office, shut the door silently, and turned on her laptop. She wasn't a heartbroken wife looking for dirty text messages. She was a forensic auditor mapping a battlefield. She opened the file cabinet in the corner. Richard rarely touched it. He called it boring administrative stuff. To him, it was just paper. To Eleanor, it was structure. She pulled out the documents. Loan statements, credit card balances, payment schedules, transfer receipts. She spread them across the large oak desk. At first, the sheer volume of his financial parasitism felt overwhelming. But Eleanor forced herself to focus. She started organizing. One pile for his personal credit cards. One for the business loans she was co-signing. One for the mysterious consulting transfers that she now suspected were funding Mia's lifestyle. Minutes turned into hours. As the picture became clearer, her stomach tightened not with pain, but with clinical disgust. The luxury car lease he claimed the company was paying for? The payments were automatically deducted from her salary account. The small business loan? Still active, draining her savings every month. This isn't support, Eleanor murmured to the empty room, her eyes scanning a massive credit card bill. This is dependency, and it is entirely intentional. She reached for her secondary, encrypted phone, a device Richard did not know existed, provided by her father's security team. She began taking high-resolution pictures of every single document. She paused, staring at a specific receipt that made her jaw clench. It was a transfer for $5,000. She remembered the night she made it. Richard had come to her, running his hands through his hair, looking incredibly stressed. I just need help this one time, El. The payroll is short. I'll fix it. She had believed him. She had comforted him. Now, cross-referencing the date with the credit card statements, she saw exactly where that $5,000 had gone. A luxury boutique hotel in Aspen. A weekend getaway with Mia. She had literally funded her own betrayal. Eleanor closed her eyes briefly, letting the realization settle into her bones. Then she opened them, sharper and colder than before. No more, she whispered. She opened her encrypted email and typed a single message to a contact named Arthur Hayes. Arthur was not a marriage counselor. He was the chief legal counsel for the Sterling Global Syndicate, a ruthless, brilliant corporate fixer who dismantled hostile companies for sport. Arthur, Eleanor typed, her fingers flying across the keys. Richard's startup debt. I want Sterling Global to buy it. Buy the primary loans, buy the secondary credit lines, buy the lease on his office building. I want our family holding company to be his sole creditor by the end of the week. And Arthur? Structure it with the maximum penalty clauses for default. She had sent. By the time Richard woke up the next morning, the documents were neatly arranged back in the cabinet. There was no visible sign of the financial autopsy she had performed. Richard walked into the kitchen, loosening his tie, smelling of fresh cologne. Morning, beautiful, he smiled, pouring himself a cup of the coffee she had brewed. He kissed her cheek. I have a huge meeting today with a potential investor. If I land this, we are golden. Knock them dead. Richard, Eleanor replied smoothly, taking a sip of her tea. He walked out the door, entirely unaware that the massive, invisible jaws of the Sterling Empire had just unhinged and were preparing to swallow him whole. Chapter 3. Cutting the lifelines the following Monday, Eleanor walked into the sterile, glass-walled lobby of a major commercial bank in downtown Chicago. She was dressed in her usual understated work attire, a tailored beige trench coat, simple slacks, and a leather tote bag. She looked exactly like the mundane, mid-level accountant Richard believed her to be. That was entirely the point. She was not trying to create drama. She was engineering a controlled demolition. Good morning. The young teller smiled from behind the counter. How can I help you today? I need to close a joint checking account and open a new, individual account, Eleanor said, her voice calm and remarkably polite. And I need to halt all automated clearinghouse transfers currently attached to my payroll direct deposit. The teller clicked her mouse a few times. Of course. Let me just pull up your profile. Ah, the joint account with Mr. Richard Vance. I see several recurring payments scheduled for the 15th of the month. 2 auto loans, a commercial office lease payment, and a high-yield business loan. The teller looked up, offering a sympathetic, knowing smile. If we close this account and halt the transfers, those payments will bounce unless alternate funding is provided. I am aware, Eleanor replied, her expression perfectly blank. Please proceed. I also need you to freeze the secondary credit cards attached to my name. Within 20 minutes, the financial umbilical cord that had been quietly sustaining Richard's flashy lifestyle was entirely severed. Eleanor walked out of the bank and into the crisp autumn sunlight. She didn't feel the crushing heartbreak she had always imagined would accompany the end of her marriage. She felt a profound, exhilarating sense of relief. It was the quiet, steady relief of a medic finally applying a tourniquet to a bleeding wound. That evening, Richard came home unusually early. He tossed his keys onto the entry table with a loud, aggressive clatter. He did not greet her with a kiss. "Did you do something to the bank accounts?" he demanded, walking straight into the kitchen where Eleanor was chopping vegetables. His voice was sharp, laced with irritation and a faint, underlying tremor of panic. Eleanor set her knife down carefully. She turned to face him, wiping her hands on a towel. "I separated our finances," she said simply. Richard stopped in his tracks, clearly thrown by her bluntness. He had expected confusion. He had expected her to claim it was a banking error. "You what?" he snapped, his face flushing. "Why the hell would you do that without talking to me first? Do you have any idea how embarrassing it was to have my corporate Amex declined at lunch today in front of a client? If your card declined, Richard, that means you have exhausted your own funds," Eleanor replied, her voice remaining perfectly level. "The joint account was primarily funded by my salary. I decided I am no longer comfortable financing your business expenses." Richard stared at her, as if she had suddenly started speaking a foreign language. He stepped closer, attempting to use his physical presence to intimidate her. "This is a partnership, Eleanor," he raised his voice, pointing a finger at her. "My company is on the verge of a massive breakthrough. I told you, once the Series B funding clears, we are set. You are supposed to be supporting me." "I have supported you for 3 years, Richard," Eleanor said, holding his angry gaze without flinching. "But I realized recently that my support is being treated as a permanent utility rather than a temporary bridge. Personal debts are your responsibility going forward." Richard let out a harsh, incredulous laugh, running a hand through his hair. "Are you serious right now?" he scoffed, his arrogance returning as he tried to regain control of the narrative. "You are throwing a tantrum over money? You are going to jeopardize our future because you're feeling a little insecure." "I'm not insecure, Richard," Eleanor said softly, her eyes entirely dead. "I am informed." The word hung in the air between them. Richard's jaw tightened. He didn't know what she knew, but the utter lack of emotion in her voice unnerved him. He retreated to his usual tactic, minimizing and gaslighting. "You're being hysterical," he muttered, turning his back on her and walking toward the living room. "Turn the transfers back on, Elle. I don't have time for these games right now. I have a company to run." "The transfers are canceled, Richard," Eleanor called after him. "You will have to find another way to fund your lifestyle." Richard slammed the door to the home office. Eleanor picked up her knife and calmly resumed chopping vegetables. He didn't know it yet, but the bounced credit card at lunch was just the first tiny tremor of the massive earthquake heading his way. Chapter 4. The Mistress oversteps 2 days later. Eleanor was sitting at her desk in her downtown office, reviewing a quarterly report for one of Sterling Global's actual subsidiaries. Her desk phone rang. It was the front lobby receptionist, Ms. Evans. The receptionist said, using Eleanor's married alias, "There is a woman here to see you. She doesn't have an appointment, but she says it's extremely urgent. A Ms. Mia Thorne." Eleanor paused. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. Mia, the mistress, the 24-year-old girl from the balcony who thought Eleanor was a plain, boring stepping stone. Eleanor smiled. A slow, chilling smile. "Send her up," Eleanor said. A few minutes later, the heavy glass door to Eleanor's office swung open. Mia walked in, wearing a designer trench coat, carrying a massive Prada tote bag, and glaring at Eleanor with undisguised contempt. She looked entirely out of place in the sleek, minimalist, high-security corporate environment. Mia slammed the door shut behind her and marched up to Eleanor's desk. "You need to turn the credit cards back on," Mia demanded, her voice shrill and dripping with entitled arrogance. Eleanor leaned back in her ergonomic leather chair. She didn't offer Mia a seat. She simply looked at her, examining her like a biologist inspecting a particularly loud, unintelligent insect. "Excuse me," Eleanor asked calmly. "Don't play dumb with me," Mia sneered, crossing her arms. "Richard told me what you did. He told me you're throwing a jealous fit and freezing the accounts because you're paranoid. You embarrassed him, and you embarrassed me." "I embarrassed you?" Eleanor repeated, raising a single, elegant eyebrow. "My rent check bounced this morning," Mia yelled, slamming her hand on Eleanor's desk. "The landlord threatened to evict me. Richard's corporate accounts are tied to that lease. And because you locked the funds, I look like a deadbeat." Eleanor let out a soft, genuine laugh. The sheer, breathtaking audacity of the girl was almost impressive. "Let me make sure I understand this," Eleanor said, folding her hands neatly on her desk. "You came to my place of business to demand that I continue using my personal salary to pay for the luxury apartment where you are currently sleeping with my husband?" Mia flushed, a brief flash of guilt crossing her face before it hardened back into aggressive vanity. "Richard is going to leave you anyway," Mia spat, leaning over the desk, trying to look intimidating. "He doesn't love you. You are boring. You are plain. He told me he's just waiting for you to finish paying off his loans before he files the divorce papers. You're just a bank to him. So stop acting like you have any power here and turn the money back on, or I swear to God, I will make your life a living hell." Eleanor didn't blink. She didn't raise her voice. She reached in her desk drawer and pulled out a sleek, black folder. She opened it and slid a single sheet of paper across the desk toward Mia. "What is this?" Mia snapped, looking down at the paper. "That," Eleanor said, her voice dropping to a terrifying, glacial temperature, "is a formal notice of criminal liability." Mia frowned, her eyes scanning the legal jargon on the page. "I'm a forensic auditor, Mia," Eleanor said smoothly. "I spent the weekend reviewing Richard's corporate ledgers. I noticed that the monthly rent for your apartment, the Cartier watch on your wrist, and your recent vacation to Aspen were all billed to his company as client entertainment and consulting fees." Mia's face began to lose its color. "That is called embezzlement," Eleanor continued, her eyes locking onto Mia's terrified face. "It is federal wire fraud. And because you are an employee of his firm and the direct beneficiary of those stolen funds, you are legally classified as a co-conspirator in a felony fraud scheme." "Ew. You're lying," Mia stammered, backing away from the desk, her arrogant bravado instantly shattering. "Richard owns the company. He can spend the money however he wants. Richard owns a company that is currently heavily leveraged by outside debt," Eleanor corrected her coldly. "Debt that, as of yesterday morning, was entirely purchased by a private equity firm that I control." Mia stared at her, her mouth hanging open in absolute shock. You control? You came into my office to tell me I'm a bank," Eleanor said, standing up slowly. She smoothed her skirt, projecting an aura of immense, crushing authority. "You are absolutely right. I'm a bank, and I'm officially calling in my loans." Eleanor pointed a manicured finger at the office door. "Get out of my building, Mia, and I highly suggest you pack your bags. Because you aren't just getting evicted from your apartment. You're getting fired. And if you ever speak to me again, I will personally hand this folder to the FBI." Mia looked at the document, looked at Eleanor's terrifyingly calm face, and burst into tears. She turned and ran out of the office, the heavy glass door slamming shut behind her. Eleanor sat back down. She picked up her phone and dialed her lawyer. "Arthur," Eleanor said. "Execute Phase 2. Crush the company." Chapter 5. The collapse of the House of Cards, the destruction of Richard's startup, did not happen with a loud explosion. It happened with the silent, terrifying efficiency of a financial guillotine. It began at 9 a.m. the following Tuesday. Richard was sitting in his sleek, glass-walled corner office, nursing a massive hangover and a growing sense of panic. Ever since Eleanor had cut off the joint accounts, his life had become a logistical nightmare. He had maxed out his personal credit cards just to keep his Porsche from being repossessed. He had promised Mia he would fix the issue with her apartment lease, but he was secretly terrified. He was banking everything, his entire future, his ego, his escape plan, on a massive Series B funding round that was supposed to close by the end of the week. His desk phone buzzed. It was his chief financial officer, David. "Richard, we have a massive problem." David's voice crackled through the speaker, sounding breathless and panicked. "I need you in the conference room. Now." Richard groaned, rubbing his temples. David, handle it. I'm preparing for the venture capital pitch this afternoon. There is no pitch this afternoon, Richard, David yelled, abandoning all professional decorum. The venture capitalists pulled out. All of them. And the bank just froze our primary operating accounts. Richard froze. The blood drained from his face so fast he felt dizzy. He jumped up from his desk and sprinted down the hallway to the main conference room. David was standing at the head of the long table, surrounded by stacks of financial documents, looking as though he were about to have a heart attack. What the hell are you talking about? Richard demanded, slamming the door shut behind him. Why would the bank freeze our accounts? We have a clean credit line. We had a clean credit line, David corrected him, his hands shaking as he held up a thick legal document. Until yesterday, a private equity firm called Vanguard Holdings just bought up all of our outstanding primary and secondary debt. Every single loan we took out to launch this company is now owned by them. So what? Richard snapped, his arrogance trying to mask his rising terror. We just pay them instead of the bank. It's a standard debt acquisition. You don't understand, Richard, David said, his voice dropping to a horrified whisper. Vanguard Holdings didn't just buy the debt. They triggered the immediate repayment clauses. They're calling in the loans. All of them. Today. Richard stared at him, his mind completely short-circuiting. They can't do that. We don't have the liquidity. We need the Series B funding to cover. The Series B investors pulled out because Vanguard Holdings sent them a forensic audit report this morning, David interrupted, throwing a separate folder onto the table. Richard looked down at the folder. It had a familiar, terrifyingly precise aesthetic. The audit report details over $200,000 in misappropriated corporate funds, David continued, his eyes widening with disgust as he looked at Richard. It lists luxury hotel stays in Aspen, Cartier jewelry, and a luxury apartment lease in downtown Chicago, all billed as client entertainment and consulting fees. David pointed an accusatory finger at his boss. The apartment lease is in Mia's name, Richard. You used company operating funds to pay for your mistress's lifestyle, and you forged my signature on the expense approvals. It's a lie. Richard screamed, backing away from the table. It's a setup. I can explain the expenses. They were legitimate business networking. Save it, Richard, David spat, disgust replacing his panic. Vanguard Holdings has already forwarded the audit to the SEC and the IRS. The company is officially insolvent as of 10 minutes ago. We are bankrupt, and you're going to federal prison. Richard couldn't breathe. The room spun violently. His beautiful, carefully constructed empire was collapsing around him at the speed of light. Who? Richard gasped, gripping the back of a leather chair to keep from collapsing. Who owns Vanguard Holdings? Before David could answer, the heavy glass doors to the conference room swung open. Two men in dark, impeccably tailored suits walked in. They moved with the terrifying, synchronized precision of high-end corporate fixers. Behind them walked Eleanor. She was not wearing her usual plain, beige accountant attire. She wore a sharp, custom-tailored charcoal suit that projected absolute, unquestionable authority. Her hair was pulled back into a sleek, unforgiving bun. She looked entirely alien to Richard. She looked like a predator. Hello, Richard, Eleanor said, her voice smooth, calm, and utterly devoid of the warmth he was used to. Richard stared at her, his brain completely unable to process the visual information. Eleanor, what are you doing here? You need to leave. We are dealing with a massive corporate crisis. I am aware, Eleanor replied, stepping into the room and taking a seat at the opposite end of the long mahogany table. She crossed her legs and folded her hands neatly in front of her. I'm the crisis. Richard laughed. It was a pathetic, broken, hysterical sound. You? What are you talking about? You're an accountant. I'm a forensic auditor, Richard. Eleanor corrected him softly. And my maiden name is Sterling. As in, Sterling Global Syndicate, the parent company of Vanguard Holdings. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of a tomb sealing shut. David, the CFO, gasped and took a slow step backward, realizing exactly who was sitting in his conference room. Richard's mouth opened and closed silently, like a dying fish. The arrogant tech CEO looked as though he had just been struck by lightning. Sterling, Richard whispered, the words scraping against his dry throat. Your family is. You're a billionaire. I was, Eleanor said, her eyes locking onto his with terrifying intensity. Until I decided I wanted a normal life. I wanted a man who loved me for my character, not my bank account. I want a partnership. So, I hid my wealth. I played the supportive, quiet wife. I managed your home. I managed your ego. She leaned forward slightly, resting her arms on the table. And how did you repay that loyalty, Richard? You told your 24-year-old mistress that I was a plain, boring stepping stone. You told her that the second I finished paying off your debts with my little salary, you were going to throw me out because I wasn't in your class. Richard fell to his knees. His legs simply gave out. The sheer magnitude of his mistake crushed him with the physical weight of a falling building. He had married a billionaire heiress, and he had thrown her away for a public relations assistant because he thought he was smarter than her. Eleanor, please, Richard sobbed, crawling forward on his knees, his expensive suit wrinkling against the carpet. I was stupid. I was stressed. I didn't mean any of it. It was just a stupid joke. I love you. You love my utility, Eleanor corrected him, completely unmoved by his tears. You love what I can do for you. But you are no longer useful to me, Richard. And you are certainly not permanent. She gestured to the two men standing behind her. These gentlemen are my legal team, Eleanor announced. They are here to officially execute the hostile takeover of this firm. Your employment is terminated immediately. You will surrender your keys, your corporate phone, and your laptop. You can't take my company. Richard howled, slamming his fists against the floor. I built this. You built a house of cards using stolen funds, Eleanor stated coldly. I'm simply blowing it down. She stood up, smoothing her jacket. Oh, and Richard, Eleanor added, pausing at the door. I wouldn't bother going back to the apartment tonight. The lease was in my proxy company's name. I had the locks changed this morning. Your belongings are currently sitting in garbage bags in the alleyway. Richard stared at her, his face a mask of absolute, paralyzing horror. Enjoy your new class, Eleanor said. She turned and walked out of the conference room, leaving Richard sobbing on the floor of the empire he had just lost. Chapter 6. The dog-eat-dog world. An hour later, Richard stumbled out of his former office building. He carried nothing but a cardboard box containing a framed photo of himself and a few useless desk trinkets. The security guards, men he used to greet by name, had escorted him out the front door like a common criminal. It was raining, a cold, miserable Chicago downpour. He didn't have a car. His Porsche had been seized by the corporate liquidators in the parking garage. He didn't have a credit card that worked. His bank accounts were frozen by the feds. He didn't even have an apartment to go home to. He had exactly $40 in cash in his wallet. Desperate, shivering, and completely broken, Richard hailed a cheap taxi and gave the driver the address to Mia's luxury apartment in the Gold Coast district. He needed Mia. She was the only thing he had left. They would figure this out. He was a brilliant entrepreneur. He could start over. She loved him. She would support him while he rebuilt. The taxi dropped him off in front of the sleek, high-rise building. Richard practically ran into the lobby, his clothes soaked through, shivering violently. He took the elevator to the penthouse floor and pounded frantically on Mia's door. Mia, open up. It's Richard, he yelled, banging his fist against the heavy wood. The door swung open. Mia stood there. She was not wearing the sexy crimson dress from the balcony. She was wearing sweatpants, and her face was red and blotchy from crying. Behind her, the luxurious apartment was in total chaos. Designer clothes were thrown everywhere. Two massive suitcases sat open on the floor, half-packed. Mia, thank God, Richard gasped, stepping forward to pull her into a hug. Everything is gone. Eleanor. She set me up. She's a billionaire, Mia. She owns the company. She took everything. I'm broke. Mia didn't hug him back. She placed both hands on his chest and shoved him violently backward into the hallway. Don't touch me, she screamed, her voice echoing down the pristine corridor. Richard stumbled, looking at her in shock. Mia, what are you doing? I need you. We need to get a lawyer. I already have a lawyer. Mia shrieked, tears of rage spilling down her face. My father hired one for me this morning after the FBI called him. Richard froze. The FBI? You told me the money was yours. Mia howled, throwing a heavy, silver-framed photo of the two of them directly at Richard's head. He ducked, and the frame shattered against the wall behind him. You told me the apartment was a bonus. You used stolen money to pay for my life, and now I am being charged as a co-conspirator in a federal fraud case. Mia, please, I can explain. Richard pleaded, holding his hands up defensively. We can fight this together. I'm not fighting anything with you. You broke, pathetic loser. Mia spat, her face twisting into an ugly mask of pure, selfish hatred. The illusion of their grand, passionate romance shattered instantly. She didn't look at him like a god anymore. She looked at him like he was a disease. I took a plea deal, Richard. Mia yelled, stepping forward to scream directly in his face. I gave the feds everything. I gave them your text messages. I gave them the voicemails where you bragged about forging the ledgers. I told them you manipulated me. Richard felt the last remaining ounce of breath leave his lungs. He stared at the young, vibrant girl he had thrown his entire life away for. She had completely, instantly sold him out to save herself. You betrayed me, Richard whispered, his voice cracking. You betrayed yourself when you got caught by your boring, plain wife. Mia sneered cruelly. Get out of here before I call building security. You don't belong in this building anymore. You can't afford it. She slammed the heavy door directly in his face. The loud, final click of the deadbolt echoed in the hallway. Richard stood alone in the quiet corridor, dripping wet, holding a cardboard box of garbage. He had no money, no wife, no mistress, no company, and no home. He slid down the wall until he was sitting on the floor, burying his face in his hands. He finally realized the absolute, terrifying truth. Eleanor hadn't just destroyed him. She had let him destroy himself. Chapter 7. The sentencing 6 months later, the brutal Chicago winter had given way to a crisp, bright spring. But inside the federal courthouse downtown, the atmosphere was as cold and sterile as a morgue. The courtroom was packed to absolute capacity. The downfall of Richard Vance, the charismatic tech CEO who had secretly married into the sterling billion-dollar dynasty only to throw it all away for a junior assistant, had become the most spectacular, highly publicized corporate implosion of the decade. Reporters, former investors, and curious onlookers squeezed onto the hard wooden benches, eager to witness the final act. Eleanor sat in the front row of the gallery, flanked by her father's intimidating, silver-haired lead attorney, Arthur Hayes, and 2 massive private security contractors. She wore a sharp, impeccably tailored charcoal power suit. Her posture was flawless. She looked exactly like the woman who had engineered this entire downfall, precise, unyielding, and utterly victorious. She was no longer hiding behind plain sweaters and a quiet demeanor. She was Eleanor Sterling, and she commanded the room without saying a single word. The heavy wooden door next to the judge's bench opened with a loud click. Richard was led into the courtroom by a federal bailiff. A collective, hushed murmur rippled through the gallery. The physical transformation was shocking. The arrogant, handsome, perfectly groomed tech mogul was completely gone. In his place was a hollow, gaunt man wearing a drab, oversized, standard-issue, orange jumpsuit. His hair was visibly thinning, his shoulders were slumped in permanent defeat, and his skin had a sickly, gray pallor for months in a holding cell. He wore heavy iron shackles around his wrists and ankles, the chains clinking loudly and humiliatingly with every slow, shuffling step he took. He took his seat next to his exhausted, overworked public defender. He didn't even glance back at the gallery. He didn't have the strength to look at the people he had defrauded, or the wife he had so casually discarded. The trial had been brutal, incredibly swift, and entirely one-sided. It was a legal massacre. David, the former CFO, had testified for 2 days, laying bare the complex, fraudulent accounting structures Richard had forced him to implement. He handed over every forged ledger and every incriminating email in exchange for his own immunity. Mia had also taken a stand. She had cried hysterically, played the naive, manipulated victim to perfection, and detailed exactly how Richard had used stolen corporate funds to pay for her silence, her luxury apartment, and her affection. The jury had clearly despised her obvious greed, but they had despised Richard infinitely more. But the most damning evidence had come from the prosecution's star witness, the forensic audit report compiled by Eleanor herself. It was a masterpiece of financial tracing, detailing every stolen cent down to the decimal point. legally impossible to refute or deny. The judge, a stern, imposing woman with zero tolerance for white-collar crime, struck her heavy wooden gavel. The loud crack silenced the murmuring courtroom instantly. "Richard Vance," the judge began, her deep voice echoing across the cavernous room. "Please stand." Richard slowly rose to his feet, his shackles clinking. He kept his eyes firmly fixed on the wooden table in front of him, unable to look the judge in the eye. Over the course of this trial, the judge continued, looking down at Richard with profound, undisguised disgust, this court has been presented with a staggering display of greed, narcissism, and profound deceit. You used your position of power and trust to systematically defraud your business partners, your investors, and your own family. The judge adjusted her glasses, looking down at her thick stack of paperwork. You treated the law, and the people who trusted you, as mere inconveniences to your personal, narcissistic desires. You built an empire on a foundation of lies and stolen funds. And when that foundation began to crack, you attempted to use the people closest to you as collateral damage. The judge paused, letting the heavy, suffocating silence settle over the room. It is the ruling of this court that you, Richard Vance, are guilty on all 18 counts of federal wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and tax evasion. Richard squeezed his eyes shut. He didn't cry. He just swayed slightly on his feet, as if a strong wind could blow him over. "I sentence you to 12 years in a federal penitentiary, without the possibility of early parole," the judge declared, her voice ringing with absolute finality. "Furthermore, you are ordered to pay $4.2 million in restitution to the victims of your fraud." Richard collapsed back into his chair, burying his face in his shackled hands. A harsh, ragged, utterly broken sob finally tore from his throat. 12 years. His firm was gone. His reputation was permanently destroyed. His fortune was seized. His legacy was nothing more than a criminal record and a cautionary tale taught in business ethics classes. The judge turned her attention to the defense table where Mia sat, trembling in a modest gray suit, her father sitting nervously behind her in the gallery. "Mia Thorne," the judge said coldly, "while your cooperation was instrumental in securing this conviction, it does not erase the fact that you actively and enthusiastically participated in a multi-million-dollar fraud scheme purely to fund a lavish, illicit lifestyle." Mia began to cry, her shoulders shaking violently. "I sentence you to 3 years in federal prison," the judge declared. Mia let out a loud, piercing wail, burying her face in her hands as her father gasped in horror behind her. "Court is adjourned," the judge announced. The gavel banged. The sound was as final as a closing coffin. The courtroom slowly began to clear as the gallery erupted into hushed, frantic chatter. Reporters rushed toward the heavy wooden doors, eager to file their stories on the spectacular downfall of Richard Vance and his mistress. Eleanor stood up slowly. She smoothed the front of her charcoal suit jacket, her expression a mask of absolute, unbreakable calm. She picked up her slim leather briefcase and began walking toward the center aisle to exit. As she reached the aisle, the 2 federal bailiffs hauled Richard to his feet. "Let's go, Vance," one of them grunted, grabbing his arm roughly. As they turned to lead him toward the holding cell door, Richard stopped. He dug his canvas shoes into the carpet, resisting the bailiffs just long enough to turn his head and look directly at Eleanor. His eyes were completely destroyed. The arrogant, untouchable light that had once defined him, the smug confidence he had displayed on the balcony 6 months ago, was entirely extinguished. There was no anger left in him. There was no defiance. There was only the crushing, agonizing realization of what he had thrown away for a fleeting moment of ego. He looked at the woman he had dismissed as a plain, boring, middle-class stepping stone. The woman who had quietly, surgically dismantled his entire universe without ever raising her voice or shedding a single tear in his presence. He had wanted a woman in his class. He had ultimately found out that he was entirely out of hers. Richard mouthed 2 pathetic, broken words to her across the silent distance of the courtroom. "I'm sorry." Eleanor stopped walking. She did not nod. She did not smile. She did not offer him a single, microscopic ounce of forgiveness, pity, or closure. She simply stared at him with absolute, chilling indifference. She looked at him the exact same way an auditor looks at a ledger that has finally, successfully been balanced to zero. The bailiff shoved Richard forward. "Keep moving." Richard stumbled, his heavy chains clanking loudly against the floor. He disappeared through the heavy wooden door, swallowed whole by the federal prison system and the inescapable consequences of his own arrogance. Eleanor turned and walked out of the courtroom, her head held high. As Eleanor exited the heavy bronze doors of the federal courthouse, she stepped out into the bright, crisp Chicago afternoon. The rain that had characterized the final, dying months of her marriage was gone. The heavy gray clouds had broken, casting a warm, brilliant golden light over the towering city skyline. A skyline Richard had once proudly claimed he was going to conquer, and one he would now never see again except through thick, barred windows. A sleek, black, armored town car was waiting for her at the curb, its engine idling with a low, powerful hum. Standing next to the open rear door was Arthur Hayes, the senior legal counsel for Sterling Global, the man who oversaw her newly activated corporate power. He smiled warmly, an expression of genuine respect, as she approached. "Congratulations, Eleanor," Arthur said, holding the heavy door open for her. "The verdict was exactly as you predicted. The restitution order ensures he will never be able to hold a corporate banking account for the rest of his natural life." "Numbers do not lie, Arthur," Eleanor replied smoothly, sliding into the luxurious, cream-colored leather-back seat. "Only people do." Arthur closed the door with a solid, satisfying thud and got into the front passenger seat. The driver smoothly merged the heavy car into the bustling city traffic, leaving the courthouse far behind. The final liquidation advances startup was completed this morning, Arthur noted, looking down at his glowing tablet. The commercial real estate developer finalized the purchase of the lakefront property in Medina. They are bringing in the bulldozers on Monday morning to tear the house down. It will be completely leveled to make room for a new development. Eleanor felt a profound, deep-seated sense of peace settle over her chest. The house, the massive, glass-and-steel monument to Richard's towering ego and his deceit, would be physically erased from the earth, just as he had been erased from her life. "Excellent," she said simply, opening her own laptop and bringing it out of sleep mode. "And the offshore trust?" Arthur asked, swiping to a new screen. "The liquidated funds are secure and fully diversified across 3 international markets. Have you decided what you want to do with the capital? Your father suggested rolling it into the primary Sterling Tech portfolio." Eleanor looked out the tinted window at the passing city. For 3 years, she had made herself incredibly small to make Richard feel big. She had hidden her brilliance, her strategic, mathematical mind, and her ruthless competence to play the role of the supportive, quiet muse. She had sacrificed her own ambition to build a man who ultimately tried to discard her the precise moment he felt powerful enough to stand on his own. He had wanted to leave her with absolutely nothing. He had called her useful, but not permanent. Instead, he had unknowingly handed her the keys to absolute, untouchable freedom. "I received an email this morning from my real estate broker in Tuscany," Eleanor said, a genuine, unburdened smile finally touching her lips. "The paperwork for the historic vineyard in Montepulciano has cleared. The estate is completely, legally, and permanently mine." Arthur smiled, looking back at her over his shoulder. "A vineyard in Italy. That sounds like a beautiful, well-deserved retirement, Eleanor." "I am not retiring, Arthur." Eleanor corrected him gently, her eyes glinting with sharp, renewed, and terrifying ambition. "I am opening a boutique forensic auditing firm, based in Europe. We are going to specialize entirely in international asset recovery for spouses who have been financially abused and manipulated." She closed her laptop with a satisfying, decisive snap. There are a lot of arrogant men in this world who think they can hide their money, their mistresses, and their mistakes in offshore shell companies, Eleanor said, leaning back against the plush leather seat, feeling the immense power of her own agency. "I'm going to make a very lucrative career out of proving them wrong." The town car sped toward the private airfield, carrying her away from the wreckage of her past, and toward a future she entirely, fiercely controlled. Some women shatter when they are betrayed. They cry, they scream, they throw expensive vases at the wall, and they beg for closure from men who are utterly incapable of giving it. They let the betrayal define them, letting the trauma turn them into victims. But an auditor knows the ultimate truth. Closure is not an apology. Closure is not a tearful confession, or a dramatic screaming match in the rain, or a text message explaining why. Closure is making absolutely sure the math is irreversibly, flawlessly correct. The ledger was perfectly balanced, and Eleanor Sterling was finally free. If this story lit a fire in you, if you understand the quiet, immovable power of a woman who turns her silence into a weapon, hit the subscribe button. Turn on notifications. Because the stories worth hearing are about the invisible women who refuse to stay down when the world pushes them to the floor. See you in the next one.